The Texas Conversion Part 1. They thought America was the devil. July 14th, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The thermometer nailed to the mess hall post read 104 degrees. But it was not the heat that made Hauptmann Friedrich Muller's blood run cold. It was the smell drifting across the barbed wire fence. Real bacon, American bacon, sizzling in a cast iron skillet held by a weathered hand that belonged to a man who should have been his enemy. Fritz stood rigid in his torn Wehrmacht uniform, his hands gripping the wire so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Behind him, 5 other German prisoners of war shifted their weight in the dust, their eyes fixed on the same impossible scene. A Texas rancher, tall and lean with a face carved by decades of sun and wind, was cooking breakfast. Not for himself, for them. Everything the Fuhrer had told him was a lie. But Fritz did not know that yet, not completely. Not in the way that would shatter him and remake him into something new. That would come later, piece by piece, meal by meal, conversation by conversation. It would come in the taste of brisket smoked for 14 hours. It would come in the feel of a horse beneath him running free across Texas grassland. It would come in a small Methodist church where a man who had lost everything would choose forgiveness over hate. But first it would come in the form of bacon. The rancher turned toward them. His Stetson hat cast a shadow across eyes that held something Fritz had not seen in 3 years of war. Not pity, not cruelty, something else entirely. The man called out in English, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of the Texas prairie. "Boys, y'all gonna stand there like fence posts, or y'all gonna eat." An interpreter, a young private from the camp, translated the words into German. Fritz heard them, but they made no sense. Prisoners did not eat with their captors. Prisoners were not invited. Prisoners were given rations and water and told to be grateful they were still breathing. Fritz had been a prisoner for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since his Panzer tank took a direct hit outside Caen. 6 weeks since he woke up in a British field hospital with his ears ringing and his uniform burned. 6 weeks since they shipped him across the Atlantic in the belly of a transport ship packed in with 300 other captured Germans, all of them waiting to see what the Americans would do to them. The propaganda films had been very clear about what Americans did to prisoners. They worked them to death in mines. They starved them. They beat them. Americans were soft and decadent, yes, but they were also mongrels, a mixed-race nation without honor or discipline. They would treat German soldiers the way animals were treated. This is what Fritz had been told. This is what he believed. But when the train pulled into Texas and the gates of Camp Hearn opened, Fritz saw something different. Rows of neat barracks. A hospital tent with a red cross painted on clean white canvas. German prisoners walking between buildings without shackles. American guards who carried rifles but did not point them. And now this, a man cooking bacon for his enemies. The rancher set down his spatula and walked toward the fence. He was 58 years old, though Fritz did not know that yet. His name was Clayton Harrison, though Fritz had not learned it yet. He had buried his only son 6 weeks earlier, killed by a German sniper in France, though Fritz would not discover this devastating truth for several more hours. Clay stopped 3 feet from the fence and looked at each prisoner in turn. When his gaze reached Fritz, it held there. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, not of faces, but of something deeper. 2 men who had each seen too much. 2 men who carried weight that could not be set down. "I am told you speak some English," Clay said. Fritz nodded. "Some, yes." "Good. Then hear me clear. You are on my property to work. I need hands to mend fences and herd cattle. The Army says you will do this work, and I will feed you proper. Not prison rations. Real food, the same food I eat. That is the deal." Fritz struggled to understand. The same food? Why would an American rancher feed German prisoners the same food he ate? It made no tactical sense. It violated every assumption Fritz held about how victors treated the vanquished. "We are prisoners," Fritz said carefully, his English rough but functional. "Not guests." Clay tilted his head slightly as if considering this statement from multiple angles. Then he said something that would echo in Fritz's mind for the rest of his life. "You are men who need breakfast. Now sit." The rancher turned and walked back to his outdoor grill, leaving the interpreter to unlock the gate. The 6 prisoners filed through onto Clay Harrison's land. Fritz moved on instinct, his military training, keeping his spine straight and his face neutral. But inside his thoughts churned like water going down a drain. This was wrong. This violated the order of things. Prisoners did not sit at tables. They did not eat from real plates. They especially did not eat bacon that smelled like heaven and looked like something from a dream. Clay placed a tin plate in front of each man, 3 strips of bacon thick cut and perfectly crisped at the edges, 2 eggs fried with yolks still soft, 2 biscuits the size of a man's fist split open with butter melting into them, white gravy pooling at the edge of the plate. The steam rose in visible waves. Hans Schmidt, the youngest of the prisoners, at 22 years old, made a sound in his throat. It was not quite a whimper, but it was close. The boy had been a baker in Bavaria before the war. He understood food in a way soldiers rarely did. And this food, this American breakfast, spoke to something in him that had been silent for too long. Fritz stared at his plate. He had not eaten real meat in weeks. The camp provided adequate rations, yes. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. But adequate was not the same as this. This was abundance. This was the kind of meal a man ate in peacetime when the world made sense and the future held promise. The smell was overwhelming. Rendered pork fat and wood smoke and butter and something else, something Fritz could not name but recognize anyway. It was the smell of a kitchen where someone cared about the cooking, where food was not just fuel but an act of creation. Fritz's stomach betrayed him with a long, low growl. "Eat," Clay said. He was seated now at the same table, his own plate in front of him, not at the head of the table, not separated, with them. "It will get cold." Hans reached for his bacon first. His hand trembled as he lifted the strip to his mouth. But before he could take a bite, a voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Das ist verboten." Oberleutnant Kurt Weber stood from his chair so quickly it scraped backward in the dirt. He was 38, lean and hard, with eyes that held the cold certainty of a man who believed absolutely in the rightness of his cause. SS, a true believer. Kurt had spent the 6 weeks at Camp Hearn gathering other true believers around him, maintaining discipline, ensuring that German prisoners remembered who they were and what they fought for. Kurt's hand flashed out and slapped the bacon from Hans's grip. The meat fell into the dust. Hans stared at it, then at Kurt, his young face going pale. "We do not accept charity from the enemy," Kurt said in German, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We maintain dignity. We remain German soldiers." Clay Harrison did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He stood slowly, his chair scraping backward. For a moment, the 2 men faced each other across the table. Kurt rigid with ideology. Clay loose-limbed and easy, but with something hard behind his eyes. Then Clay did something that made Fritz's breath catch in his chest. He bent down. He picked up the bacon from where it had fallen. He dusted it off with his thumb. He placed it back on Hans's plate. And then he sat back down at the table. With them. Not above them. With them. "Boy," Clay said quietly, his eyes on Kurt. "I don't know what you just said, but I know what you did. And I am telling you plain. Nobody goes hungry on my land. Not livestock, not hands, and not prisoners. You got a problem with that, you can take it up with the colonel back at camp. But while you are on my property, you will eat what I cook, and you will say thank you." "Are we clear?" the interpreter translated. Kurt's jaw worked as if chewing glass. His hand twitched toward his belt, where once a sidearm would have hung. But there was no weapon now. There was only a Texas rancher who had just drawn a line in the dust with nothing but words and bacon. For a long moment, no one moved. The sun climbed higher. The bacon grew cold. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang its complicated song. Then Clay picked up his own bacon. He took a bite, chewed slowly, swallowed. Set the rest back on his plate. He looked directly at Fritz. "It is just food, son. It has nothing to do with politics." Something cracked inside Fritz's chest. Not broke, not yet, but cracked. A hairline fracture in the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Hans, tears streaming down his face, picked up the bacon. He bit into it. And despite himself, despite the shame and the confusion and the weight of Kurt's glare, he closed his eyes and chewed. The taste was everything he remembered from childhood, from before the war, from a time when food was love and love was simple. Fritz watched this. He felt Kurt's eyes on him measuring, judging. He felt the weight of his officer's rank, his responsibility to maintain discipline, his duty to the fatherland. But he also felt his own hunger, his own exhaustion, his own deep aching need for something other than concrete and wire, and the endless gray sameness of captivity. Slowly, as if moving through water, Fritz picked up his bacon. He ate. The taste exploded across his tongue, salt and smoke and fat and something indefinable, something that tasted like a place where men could sit together without hatred, where enemies could share a meal, where the future might hold something other than ash and blood. Fritz ate all three strips. He ate the eggs. He ate the biscuits, sopping up gravy until the plate shone clean. And with every bite, something inside him shifted, not loyalty. That would take time, but certainty. The absolute certainty he had carried since he was 16 years old and first put on the Hitler Youth uniform. That certainty began to dissolve like sugar in hot coffee. When the meal was finished, Clay stood and collected the plates. He brought them to a wash basin near the outdoor grill. Then he turned back to the prisoners. "We have work to do. Fritz, I am told that is your name. You come with me. I need to teach you something." Fritz stood. His body felt strange, heavy with food, but also lighter somehow. He followed Clay across the dusty yard toward a wooden corral where 5 horses stood in the shade of an old oak tree. The morning sun was climbing toward its zenith now, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Clay stopped at the fence and pointed to a gray gelding with kind eyes. "That is Rebel. Dumb name for a good horse, but my son named him when he was 10, so the name stayed." "You ever ridden?" Fritz shook his head. "No. In Wehrmacht you commanded tanks." "Tanks," Clay repeated as if tasting the word. "Well, this ain't a tank, this is a horse. And out here a man who cannot ride is not much use to anyone. So today you learn." Fritz wanted to protest. He was an officer. He had commanded men in battle. He had fought across North Africa and France. Riding a horse was beneath his station, a skill for cavalrymen and cowboys, not for modern soldiers who understood mechanized warfare. But the words died in his throat, because something in Clay's face told him that this was not optional, and something deeper, something Fritz did not want to examine too closely, told him that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what he needed. Clay opened the corral gate and walked inside. The horses moved toward him like iron filings to a magnet. He stroked Rebel's neck, speaking low words Fritz could not hear. Then he beckoned. "Come on. He will not bite." Fritz stepped into the corral. The smell of horse and hay and sun-baked wood surrounded him. Rebel turned his large head and regarded Fritz with eyes that held no judgment. Just curiosity. Just presence. "Put your hand here," Clay said, guiding Fritz's hand to the horse's shoulder. "Feel that. That is 3/4 of a ton of muscle and bone. But also that is trust. Horse has to trust you. You have to trust horse. Same as any partnership worth having." Fritz's hand rested on warm hide. He felt the animal's heartbeat slow and steady. He felt its breathing deep and calm. And for the first time in 6 weeks, Fritz felt something other than shame or fear or anger. He felt peace. The next 2 hours passed in a strange dream. Clay taught him how to approach the horse, how to read its body language, how to saddle it, cinching the straps with care but not too tight, how to mount using the stirrup for leverage, swinging his leg over in one smooth motion that took Fritz 6 attempts to achieve. And then finally how to ride. Fritz sat in the saddle, his hands gripping the reins too tightly, his body rigid with tension. Clay stood beside him, one hand on Rebel's bridle. "Relax. Horse can feel your fear. You hold tight like that horse holds tight too. Let your hips move with him. Find the rhythm." Clay clicked his tongue. Rebel began to walk. Fritz bounced in the saddle like a sack of potatoes, his teeth clacking together with each step. But slowly, gradually, his body began to understand. His hips loosened, his hands relaxed. And suddenly, he was not fighting the horse. He was moving with it. Clay let go of the bridle. "That is it. Now take him around the corral." Fritz guided Rebel in a slow circle. Once, twice, 3 times. Each lap smoother than the last. And then something happened that Fritz would remember for the rest of his life. Clay opened the corral gate. "Take him out. Ride to that fence line and back." Fritz stared. The fence line was half a mile away. Across open land. No guards, no wire. Just Texas grasslands stretching out under a sky so big it seemed to swallow everything. "I am prisoner," Fritz said carefully. "I could escape." Clay leaned against the fence post and pushed his hat back on his head. His face was unreadable. "Where would you go? You are in the middle of Texas. You do not know the land. You do not speak English well enough to pass as American. And you are wearing a uniform that marks you as enemy. You would not last 2 days." He paused, then added something that struck Fritz like a fist to the chest. "But more than that, son, I do not think you want to run. I think you want to know what it feels like to ride free, even if just for 10 minutes. So go on, ride." Fritz's throat tightened. He should refuse. He should maintain his dignity, his officer's bearing. He should remember that he was German, that these Americans were the enemy, that this kindness was surely some kind of trick or test. But God help him, he wanted to ride. He touched his heels to rebel sides. The horse broke into a trot, then a canter. The corral fell away behind them. The fence posts blurred, and Fritz rode across open Texas land with the wind in his face and the sun on his back and no wire in sight. For those 10 minutes, he was not a prisoner. He was not a German or an American or a soldier or an officer. He was just a man on a horse riding toward a horizon that seemed to promise something he had forgotten could exist. Freedom. When he returned to the corral, his body ached and his thighs burned, and his face was flushed with heat and exertion. But he was smiling. He could not help it. The smile broke across his face like sunrise, unbidden and unstoppable. Clay took Rebel's reins and nodded once. "You will get better. Take you a few weeks, but you will get there." That evening, when the truck rattled back toward Camp Hearn with 6 exhausted prisoners in the bed, Fritz sat in silence. Hans was beside him, still tasting bacon in memory. Kurt was at the far end, his face a mask of contempt and fury. But Fritz barely noticed. He was thinking about the horse, the wind, the open land, the way Clay had called him son, as if that word cost nothing, as if it meant everything. The barracks smelled of sweat and concrete, and too many men in too small a space. Fritz lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Around him, other prisoners talked in low voices about their work details, about the war, news filtering through official channels, about letters from home that never came. Kurt appeared at the foot of Fritz's bunk. His voice was quiet but hard. "You are fraternizing with the enemy." Fritz did not look at him. "I am working, following orders." "You smiled today. I saw you, on that horse." "I rode a horse. It was pleasant." "It was weakness." Kurt leaned closer. "We are German soldiers. We do not accept their charity. We do not eat their food with gratitude. We maintain discipline. We remember who we are." Fritz finally turned his head. He met Kurt's gaze directly. "Who are we, Kurt? We are prisoners. The war goes on without us. Germany fights without us. We are here eating American food and working American land. Maybe discipline is knowing when to adapt." Kurt's face flushed red. "You sound like a traitor." "I sound like a man who is tired of hating." The words surprised Fritz even as he spoke them, but once out they hung in the air like smoke. Kurt stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Fritz lay back down. His body ached from the riding, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from honest work and new skills learned. He thought about tomorrow when he would return to Clay's ranch. He thought about bacon and horses and the way the horizon looked when nothing blocked your view. And for the first time since his capture, Fritz thought about the future not with dread, but with something that might have been curiosity. Outside, the Texas night pressed down hot and vast. Cicadas sang their electric song. Somewhere in the darkness, America stretched out in all directions, mysterious and incomprehensible, and nothing at all like what the Führer had promised. Fritz closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, and in his dreams he rode a gray horse named Rebel across land that belonged to no one and everyone, while a weathered rancher watched and nodded and called him son. The Texas Conversion Part 2. They discovered real America August 12, 1900. The morning sun painted Clay Harrison's ranch in shades of gold and amber when he told Fritz to put on civilian clothes. Not his Wehrmacht uniform with its torn collar and faded insignia. Not the prison denims marked with the letters PW in white paint. Real clothes. American clothes. Got some things that might fit you, Clay said, tossing a bundle onto the porch rail. Jeans, shirt, boots, cannot have you wearing that uniform where we are going. Fritz held up the denim pants heavy and stiff with newness. Where do we go? County rodeo? Starts at noon. Clay was already moving toward his truck, a battered Ford that had seen better decades. Figured it is time you saw some real Texas culture. Colonel Jenkins approved it. Said it might do you good. Fritz stood frozen, the clothes clutched against his chest. A rodeo, a public event, among Americans, among people whose sons and brothers were dying in Europe because of men like him. The idea was insane, dangerous, impossible. And yet here was Clay waiting by the truck with that same calm expression he wore when teaching Fritz to ride, when serving him bacon, when treating him like something other than the enemy. Fritz changed in the barn. The jeans felt strange against his skin, rougher than German wool, but somehow more honest. The plaid shirt hung loose on his frame, weight lost during months of combat and capture. The boots were good leather, worn, but cared for, and they fit perfectly. When he emerged, Clay looked him over and nodded once. Could pass for a ranch hand. Keep your mouth shut and let me do the talking. Your accent will give you away if you speak much. They drove in silence through countryside that still amazed Fritz even after 3 weeks of work details. The sheer abundance of it. The space. Fields of cotton stretching to horizons that seemed to mock the cramped, bombed-out cities of Europe. Cattle grazing fat and lazy under skies unmarked by smoke or ash. You ever been to a rodeo before? Clay asked. No, in Germany we do not have this. Well, you are in for something special. Brazos County puts on a good show. Bull riding, barrel racing, roping, good people, good food. Clay paused, then added, good way to see what America is really about. The Brazos County Fairgrounds appeared as a sprawling collection of wooden stands and livestock pens in a central arena ringed with bleachers. Cars and trucks filled a dirt parking lot already baking in the August heat. Families streamed toward the entrance, children running ahead while parents carried blankets and picnic baskets. Fritz's chest tightened. These were not soldiers. These were civilians, mothers and fathers and children. People who had every reason to hate him on sight. Clay seemed to sense his hesitation. Stick close. You will be fine. They paid at the gate and entered the fairgrounds. The assault on Fritz's senses was immediate and overwhelming. The smell of popcorn and horse manure and something cooking that made his mouth water despite his nervousness. The sound of country music crackling from speakers mounted on poles. The sight of men in Stetson hats and women in summer dresses, and children with faces sticky from cotton candy. This was not supposed to exist. Not in a nation at war. In Germany, everything was rationed, controlled, measured. Entertainment was propaganda. Joy was a luxury reserved for those who served the Reich without question. But here in the middle of Texas, in the middle of a global war, Americans were having a party. Come on, Clay said. Want you to meet some people. He led Fritz toward a cluster of men gathered near a smoking barbecue pit. The pit was enormous, a metal cylinder 6 feet long, with smoke pouring from one end, and the smell of cooking meat so intense it made Fritz dizzy. 3 men stood around the pit drinking from glass bottles of Coca-Cola and talking in the easy way of old friends. They looked up as Clay approached, their faces lighting with genuine pleasure. Clay Harrison, you old rattlesnake, one of them called out. He was perhaps 60 with a weathered face and a prosthetic leg visible below his rolled-up trouser cuff. Thought maybe you were staying home these days. Jim, Clay shook the man's hand, then gestured to Fritz. This is Friedrich, works my ranch, helping with the cattle operation. Jim extended his hand to Fritz. Fritz took it, feeling the callous strength of decades of labor. The other 2 men introduced as Frank and Bobby did the same. Their grips were firm but not aggressive. Their faces showed curiosity but not suspicion. No one asked where he was from. Not yet. Friedrich, that is a German name, Frank observed. He was younger than the others, maybe 50, with the thick arms of a man who worked with his hands. You got people from the old country? Fritz's mouth went dry. This was it, the moment of discovery, the moment when these friendly faces would turn hard, when hands would reach for weapons that were surely nearby, when the illusion of normalcy would shatter. But Clay spoke first, his voice easy and unconcerned. Friedrich is German, POW from my work detail at Camp Hearn. Figured he deserved a day out, see some real American culture. The silence that followed felt like falling. Fritz waited for the anger, the violence, the righteous fury of men whose country was bleeding across two oceans. Jim looked at Fritz for a long moment. His weathered face was unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. My nephew died at Normandy, James William Tucker, 19 years old, killed by a German sniper 300 yards from Omaha Beach. Fritz felt his lungs seize. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow make this man understand that he never wanted this war, that he had been lied to, that he was sorry, so desperately sorry. But before he could speak, Jim extended his hand again. But you are here now, eating barbecue, learning about America. Maybe that is how we win this war. Not just by shooting Germans, but by showing them we are not the monsters Hitler said we were. Fritz stared at the offered hand, at this man who had every reason to hate him, who had lost family to German bullets, who could have struck him or spit on him or called for the MPs who surely patrolled the fairgrounds. Instead, he was offering peace. Fritz took his hand, and to his shame, tears began to roll down his face. I am sorry, he managed in broken English. So sorry. Jim squeezed his hand once hard, then released it. War makes killers of us all, son. Question is what we do after. Now come on, let me get you some barbecue before Bobby eats it all. The barbecue was beyond anything Fritz had imagined. Jim lifted the lid on the smoking pit, revealing brisket that had been cooking since before dawn. The meat was dark and crusted with spices, glistening with rendered fat falling apart at the touch of the carving fork. Jim cut thick slices and piled them onto a paper plate, added coleslaw, beans, cornbread, handed it to Fritz with a plastic fork and a paper napkin. Go on, that is 14 hours of smoke in patience right there. Fritz took a bite. The meat dissolved on his tongue, releasing flavors he had no words for. Salt and smoke and something sweet. Something that tasted like time and care, and a kind of love that had nothing to do with war or politics, or the thousand small cruelties that had defined the last 5 years of his life. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, tasting American barbecue under a Texas sky, Friedrich Müller understood something fundamental. This was what freedom tasted like. Not the absence of restraint, but the presence of abundance. Not the ability to do whatever you wanted, but the security to create something beautiful without fear of having it stolen or destroyed. Good right, Clay said quietly beside him. Fritz could only nod. His throat was too tight for words. They found seats in the bleachers as the rodeo began. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, introducing riders and bulls and events with a showman's flair that reminded Fritz oddly of circus barkers from his childhood in Berlin. First came the bull riding. Cowboys lowered themselves onto enormous beasts that seemed composed entirely of muscle and rage. The gate opened. The bulls exploded into the arena, bucking and spinning with a violence that made Fritz's military training seem tame by comparison. Some riders lasted seconds. One made it to the full 8 count and dismounted to thunderous applause. That takes courage, Fritz said, speaking without thinking. Clay nodded. Different kind than war. No politics in it. Just man versus beast. No ideology. No hatred. Just guts. Next came barrel racing. Women this time guiding horses at full gallop around barrels set in a cloverleaf pattern. The riders leaned so far they seemed to defy gravity, their bodies moving with their mounts in perfect synchronization. Fritz watched stunned. In Germany, women did not compete like this. They did not ride at such speeds, did not demonstrate such physical prowess in public. The entire concept violated everything he had been taught about proper gender roles, about the natural order of society. And yet here they were, fast and fearless and absolutely magnificent. Women are allowed to compete, he asked. Clay gave him a sideways look. This is America, son. Everyone competes. You got the skill and the guts, does not matter if you are man or woman. That is freedom too. The day unfolded like a dream. Fritz watched calf roping and bronc riding and team penning. He ate more barbecue than his shrunken stomach could comfortably hold. He drank cold Coca-Cola from glass bottles that sweated in the heat, and slowly, gradually, he began to relax. These Americans were not monsters. They were ranchers and shopkeepers and farmers. They were parents and grandparents and children. They laughed at the clowns who protected fallen riders from angry bulls. They cheered for good runs and groaned at near misses. They were in every way that mattered simply people. During a break between events, Bobby, the youngest of Clay's friends, turned to Fritz with genuine curiosity in his eyes. "What is it like in Germany right now? We hear things on the radio, but I figure the truth is probably different." Fritz considered the question carefully. How could he explain the reality of Germany in 1904 to someone who lived in this abundant, spacious, peaceful land? "It is very difficult," he said finally. "Cities are bombed. Food is scarce. Many men are dead. Women and old men do the work. Children are afraid all the time." He paused, then added quietly, "We were told America was weak, soft. We were told you could not fight. But I think we were told many lies." Bobby nodded slowly. "I enlist next month, going to fight in Europe, maybe France, maybe Germany itself." He looked at Fritz directly. "I hope when it is over, more Germans are like you, willing to see the truth." "I hope so too," Fritz said, and he meant it with a ferocity that surprised him. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Clay stood and stretched. "Best get you back before they miss you at camp. Colonel Jenkins gave us until sunset." They said their goodbyes. Jim shook Fritz's hand again and told him to stay safe. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. Bobby gave him a small American flag pin, the kind handed out to children at patriotic events. "Something to remember us by," Bobby said. Fritz clutched the pin in his fist the entire drive back to the ranch. Neither he nor Clay spoke much. The silence was comfortable now. The silence of men who had shared something important and needed no words to acknowledge it. But as they approached the ranch, Clay pulled the truck off the road and killed the engine. He sat for a moment, his hands still on the wheel, his eyes fixed on something distant. "Got something to tell you," Clay said finally. "Been carrying it since you first came to my place, and I figure it is time you knew." Fritz waited. "My son, Thomas. He was 22 years old. Died at Omaha Beach, June 6th. Killed by German artillery in the first wave." Clay's voice was steady, but Fritz could hear the weight beneath it. "Got the telegram, July 1st. Same day you showed up on my work detail." The air left Fritz's lungs in a rush. He stared at Clay, at this man who had fed him and taught him and treated him with kindness and patience, and only now understood the magnitude of what that kindness had cost. "You knew," Fritz whispered. "You knew your son was dead, and still you fed me. Still you taught me to ride. Still you took me to the rodeo." "I knew." Clay turned to look at Fritz directly. "And I had two choices. I could hate every German I saw for the rest of my life, or I could show at least one German what my boy died for." "What did he die for?" "Freedom, dignity, the chance to start over, second chances." Clay's eyes were wet now, though no tears fell. Thomas believed in those things, believed them enough to go on a foreign beach, so I decided I would honor him by being the man he would want me to be. Not bitter, not cruel, but someone who chose mercy over hate. Fritz broke. The tears came in great racking sobs that shook his entire body. He bent forward, his face in his hands, and wept for Thomas Harrison, who died at 22, for his own father and mother back in Germany, who he had not heard from in 6 months, for Hans, who just wanted to bake bread, for every young man on both sides who believed what they were told and died for those beliefs. But mostly he wept for himself, for the years he spent in the Hitler Youth believing the lies, for the battles he fought thinking he was saving civilization, for the person he had been and the person he was becoming, and the terrible gulf between them. Clay's hand settled on his shoulder, heavy, warm, solid. "It is all right, son. Let it out." They sat there as the Texas twilight deepened into night, two men bound by grief and war, in something that transcended both. When Fritz finally found his voice again, it came out rough and broken. "I fought for Hitler. I killed it for him. I believed him. I know." "How can you forgive me?" Clay was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his words were measured and careful. "Forgiveness is not saying what happened is okay. It is saying what happened will not own me. You did not kill my son Fritz. War killed my son. And war is made by old men who lie to young men. You were one of those young men, just like Thomas, both of you believing you were doing right. He paused, then added, difference is you are still alive. You got a chance to learn the truth, to choose different. That is the gift, Fritz, not that you are here, but that you are here now seeing clearly, and you got time to do something about it. The next morning, Fritz returned to Camp Hearn with his mind churning like a storm. The other prisoners noticed immediately. Something in him had shifted, hardened, crystallized into certainty. Kurt was waiting. I hear you went to a rodeo, Kurt said, his voice dripping with contempt, playing cowboy while Germany bleeds. Fritz met his gaze steadily. I learned something yesterday. What? How to betray your country more efficiently. I learned that everything we were taught was a lie. The confrontation happened 3 days later. Kurt and his followers, 15 hardline believers who clung to Nazi ideology like drowning men to driftwood, sabotaged an irrigation system at a neighboring farm. They broke pipes and damaged machinery and called it resistance. Colonel Jenkins was furious. The farmer, Mr. Peterson, had lost a week of work and hundreds of dollars in crops. The saboteurs were caught and sentenced to solitary confinement. But the damage was done. The camp divided into factions, those who wanted to cooperate, those who clung to the old beliefs, and those who simply wanted to survive and go home. Ideology be damned. Fritz was called to Colonel Jenkins' office that afternoon. Hauptmann Mueller, the colonel said, his American accent mangling the German rank, you are the senior officer among the general population. These men respect you. Can you control them? Fritz stood at attention, years of military training, keeping his spine straight even as his mind raced. Kurt Weber is SS, sir. He does not follow my authority. He follows Hitler's, even now. And who do you follow? The question hung in the air like smoke. This was the moment. The choice that would define everything that came after. I follow what is right, sir. Colonel Jenkins studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Dismissed. But Hauptmann, whatever you are going to do it soon. I cannot have this camp falling apart because a few zealots cannot accept that the war is lost. That evening, Fritz called a meeting of all German POWs in the main compound. 200 men gathered in the fading light, their faces curious or suspicious or simply tired. Fritz stood before them and spoke in German, knowing the guards could not understand but trusting that his message would not be seen as sedition. Kurt Weber says we must resist. Fritz began, his voice carrying across the assembled prisoners. He says working with Americans is betrayal, that accepting their food and their pay and their kindness makes us weak. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Kurt's followers, those not in confinement, stood together at the edge of the group, watching with hard eyes. I tell you, Kurt is wrong. The murmurs grew louder. I spent 3 years fighting for Hitler. I believed what I was told, that Germans were superior, that Americans were weak and decadent, that we would win because we had discipline and they had only chaos. Fritz paused, letting the words settle. But I have seen Americans now, as an enemy across a battlefield, as a man living among them. And I tell you, every single thing we were taught was a lie. Someone in the crowd shouted, traitor. Fritz did not flinch. Perhaps I am. If loyalty to lies is patriotism, then yes, I am a traitor. But I would rather betray lies than betray truth. He looked around at the faces watching him. Young faces and old faces. Faces that had seen too much and could not unsee it. Faces that wanted to believe there was something beyond the wire in the war and the weight of defeat. Americans have fed us. They have paid us for our work as the Geneva Convention requires. They have given us medical care and shelter and dignity. These are the same Americans we were told were monsters. The same Americans Hitler said would torture us and kill us. Fritz's voice grew stronger, more passionate. A rancher named Clay Harrison lost his only son to German artillery in June. His boy died at Normandy because of men like us. And that rancher, that American father, he could have treated me with cruelty. He could have worked me like a slave, or beaten me, or starved me. Instead, he taught me to ride a horse. He took me to a rodeo. He showed me what Americans fight for. Silence now, complete and total. They fight for freedom, real freedom, Not Hitler's freedom, which is only freedom to obey, but freedom to think and speak and choose. Freedom to succeed or fail on your own merit. Freedom to forgive your enemies. Fritz's voice broke slightly, but he pushed through. When this war ends, we will go home. Back to a Germany that is destroyed. A Germany that believed a madman's lies and paid the price. We will have to rebuild. Not just buildings, but souls. And we will have a choice. He looked directly at the men he knew followed Kurt. We can return as Nazis clinging to the ideology that led us to ruin. Or we can return as men who learned something better. Who saw that strength is not brutality. That discipline is not blind obedience. That the future does not have to repeat the past. Fritz raised his voice, letting it carry to every man in the compound. I was a Nazi. I wore the uniform. I said the oaths. I believed. But I am not a Nazi anymore. I am a man who knows freedom when he tastes it. And I tell you there is no going back. Not for me, and I hope not for you either. He stepped back. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Then slowly one man began to clap. Hans the young baker. Then another and another. Within moments, 40 men were applauding. The rest stood silent, some angry, some thoughtful, some simply lost adrift in a world where all the old certainties had dissolved. Kurt's followers retreated into the barracks, their faces hard with fury, but they were outnumbered now. The tide had turned. That night, Fritz lay in his bunk and waited for sleep to come. His body ached from the day's work. His mind ached from the decision he had made. But for the first time since his capture, he felt something approximating peace. He had chosen, not out of cowardice or opportunism, but out of a deep, bone-deep recognition that the path he had been on led only to death and darkness. America offered something different, something he could barely articulate but recognized in his gut as true. Freedom, forgiveness, the chance to become something other than what the world expected. Outside, the Texas night pressed down hot and vast. Inside the barracks, 200 men grappled with choices that would define the rest of their lives. And in a ranch house 5 miles away, Clay Harrison sat on his porch and thought about his son Thomas and about a German tank commander who was learning what Thomas died to defend. The war was not over. Germany had not surrendered. Men were still dying by the thousands across 2 continents. But here in a small corner of Texas, in the space between enemy and friend, something new was being born. Something that looked a lot like hope. The Texas Conversion Part 3. They carried America home forever. December 24th, 1944. Snow was falling in Europe, turning battlefields into frozen graves. In Texas, the temperature had dropped to a mild 60 degrees, what locals called winter. And the Methodist Church in Hearn stood white and perfect against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Fritz stood outside the church with 40 other German prisoners, their breath visible in the cool morning air. They wore their cleanest uniforms, the PW letters freshly painted on the backs. American MPs flanked them, rifles slung casually over shoulders, more guards of honor than guards of enemies. Colonel Jenkins had approved this. A Christmas service, a gesture of goodwill sanctioned by the Geneva Convention, and something deeper, something that recognized even enemies deserved to worship on the holiest day of the Christian calendar. Hans stood beside Fritz, his young face bright with the anticipation. In the 3 months since the bacon breakfast, Hans had transformed. He worked 6 days a week at Mrs. Eleanor Murphy's bakery in town, learning American techniques while teaching her the secrets of German bread. He had gained 20 pounds. His eyes no longer carried the haunted look of a man who expected death at any moment. I baked stolen, Hans whispered, gesturing to the cloth-wrapped bundle in his arms. Mrs. Murphy helped me. Real German Christmas bread. We bring it to share. Fritz nodded. He carried nothing except the weight of the last 6 months, the transformation that had reshaped him from the inside out. He was no longer the man who arrived in Texas believing Americans were weak. He was not yet sure what he was becoming, but he knew with a certainty that bordered on religious conviction that he would never be a Nazi again. The church doors opened. Pastor James McAllister stood in the entrance, his white hair catching the morning light like a halo. He was 65 years old, a widower, a man who had buried his son in July after D-Day claimed the boy's life on a beach in France. Fritz had met him twice before. Once at the rodeo, when the pastor shook his hand without hesitation. Once 2 weeks ago when Clay brought Fritz to a Wednesday evening service, and the pastor spoke about the Good Samaritan. about helping your enemy when he lay bleeding in the road. Now the pastor smiled, his face creasing into 1,000 wrinkles earned from decades of Texas sun and human joy and human sorrow. "Welcome," he said simply. "All of you, come in." The prisoners filed into the church. The sanctuary was small, maybe 200 seats, and already half filled with locals, families in their Sunday best, farmers in clean shirts and bolo ties, women in dresses that must have been saved from before the war, when fabric was not rationed and life was simpler. They stared as the Germans entered. Some faces showed curiosity, some showed hardness. Mrs. Henderson, who had given Fritz cookies after his first service, smiled and nodded. Mr. Peterson, whose farm Kurt's group had sabotaged, looked away, his jaw tight. Fritz understood. Forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. Mercy was not the same as trust. These people had every right to their anger, their suspicion, their grief, but they had chosen to share their church. And that choice, Fritz was learning, was what made America different. The service began with hymns Fritz recognized from childhood. Silent Night in English sounded strange to his ears, but the melody was the same. The comfort was the same. He sang quietly in German while Americans sang in English, and somehow the two languages wove together into something that transcended words. Pastor James took the pulpit. His sermon was simple and direct, the way a Texas preacher spoke to people who worked with their hands and had no patience for theological complexity. "Christmas is about God becoming man," he said, his voice carrying easily through the small space. "About the divine choosing to live among the broken and the lost and the ordinary. Choosing to be vulnerable. Choosing to love even when love was dangerous." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the congregation, lingering on the German prisoners seated in the back rows. "This year we celebrate Christmas while men die in Europe and the Pacific, while families receive telegrams that shatter their worlds, while the future remains uncertain and the present feels impossible." Another pause. Longer this time. "My son died 6 months ago, James Jr., 21 years old, killed by German artillery at Normandy." His voice cracked slightly but held. "For 6 months I asked God why. Why my boy? Why not someone else's? Why could you not protect him, save him, bring him home?" The church was absolutely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the weight of this moment. And God did not answer me with words. He answered me with presence, with people who brought casseroles, with prayers said by strangers, with the sunrise that kept coming even when I wanted the world to stay dark. Pastor James gripped the pulpit with both hands. And then Colonel Jenkins asked if our church would host German prisoners for Christmas service, men who wore the same uniform and those who killed my son. And I had a choice. I could say no, could keep my anger pure and my grief untouchable, or I could say yes, could choose to see Christ in the face of my enemy. He looked directly at Fritz. "I chose yes, not because I forgot, not because the pain is less, but because holding on to hate was killing me slower than any bullet could. Because my son died believing America represented something better than vengeance. And I will honor him by being the man he believed in." Pastor James stepped down from the pulpit. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing on wooden floors worn smooth by generations of worshipers. He stopped in front of Fritz, extended his hand. Fritz stood on shaking legs. He took the pastor's hand, and the old man pulled him into an embrace, holding him tight, while Fritz's shoulders shook with sobs he could not control. "You are forgiven, son," the pastor whispered. "Now go and live like it." The service continued, but Fritz barely registered it. His mind was caught in a loop of disbelief and gratitude, and something that felt dangerously like redemption. This man who had lost everything to German artillery had just absolved him. Not because Fritz deserved it, not because the scales were balanced, but because mercy was more powerful than justice, and love was stronger than death. After the service, the congregation moved to the church hall for a potluck dinner. Long tables had been set up, covered in checkered tablecloths already groaning under the weight of American Christmas food. Turkey and ham and dressing, sweet potato casserole and green bean almondine, cranberry sauce that shimmered like ruby jelly, pecan pie and pumpkin pie, and someone's grandmother's famous chess pie that people whispered about like it was sacred. Hans brought his stollen to the table. The German Christmas bread, dense with fruit and dusted with powdered sugar, looked foreign among the American dishes. But Mrs. Murphy had helped him make it, and she announced loudly to anyone within earshot that it was the best stolen she had ever tasted, and everyone needed to try it. People did, tentatively at first, then with genuine appreciation. And Hans glowed with pride, his face shining like a child's on Christmas morning. Clay found Fritz near the punch bowl nursing a cup of sweet tea so cold it made his teeth ache. "You holding up?" Clay asked. "I do not know what I am," Fritz admitted. "I came here as prisoner, as enemy, but these people treat me like guest." "That is the thing about Christmas," Clay said quietly. "Reminds us we are all just people trying to get by, all of us broken in some way, all of us needing grace we do not deserve." They stood together watching Americans and Germans share a meal on the day Christ was born. Children played together in the corner, their laughter a sound Fritz had almost forgotten existed. Old men talked farming with young German soldiers who had been farmers before the war made them killers. Women compared recipes across the language barrier, using hand gestures and smiles when words failed. It was impossible. It should not have worked. By all the rules of war and politics and human nature, this moment could not exist. And yet here it was, fragile and precious and absolutely real. 3 days later, Fritz received a letter. It came through the Red Cross, forwarded from address to address across a continent drowning in chaos, and it had taken 7 months to reach him. The envelope was thin, almost weightless, but Fritz's hands trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was his sister Grevita's, small and precise, the way she had been taught in school before the war destroyed such innocuous things as proper penmanship. He read it alone, sitting on his bunk, while evening light slanted through the barracks windows, and with every word, something inside him broke open and bled. Their mother was dead, killed in an Allied bombing raid on Berlin in February. She had been shopping for bread, standing in a queue like thousands of other women trying to feed their families on rations that kept shrinking. The bombs came without warning. They found pieces of her 3 blocks from the bakery. Their father was dead, drafted at 60 years old because Germany was running out of young men to feed into the meat grinder, sent to the Eastern Front in March, killed by Soviet artillery 2 weeks later. No body recovered, just a telegram that said he died serving the fatherland. Greta was alive, but barely, living in the ruins of their family home in Berlin, surviving on whatever she could scavenge or trade. She wrote that the city was unrecognizable, that people died in the streets from hunger and cold, that women and children did the work of rebuilding while old men pretended the war could still be won. "Fritz," she wrote at the end, her handwriting shakier, now less controlled. "I do not know if you will ever read this. I do not know if you are alive or dead. But if you survive, please come home. Germany needs men who can think clearly, who can help us rebuild something other than what we lost. Come home. I am so tired." Fritz folded the letter carefully. He placed it in the small wooden box where he kept his few possessions. The bacon he had eaten 7 months ago felt like a betrayal now. The rodeo, the church, the Christmas dinner, all of it felt like luxuries he had no right to enjoy while his family died and his country burned. He found Clay the next morning at the ranch. The old rancher was mending fence line, his movements economical, and practiced the work of a man who had done this particular task 10,000 times. "My mother and father are dead," Fritz said without preamble, "killed by the war. My sister is alive, but starving in Berlin." Clay stopped working. He set down his tools and removed his hat, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I am sorry, son. Truly. Why do you call me son? Your son is dead because of Germans like me. My parents are dead because of Americans like you. We should hate each other. It would be simpler." Clay was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon where heat shimmers made the air dance. "Hate is simple," he said finally. "But is complicated. Hate asks nothing of you except that you keep hating. Love asks everything. Asks you to look past what is easy and comfortable and see what is true." He turned to face Fritz directly. "Your parents did not kill my son. War killed my son. The same war that killed your parents. And war is made by men who profit from hate, who turn boys into soldiers and tell them the enemy is not human." Clay's voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "You did not choose to be born German any more than I chose to be born American. but we both get to choose what we do with the time we have left. You can spend it hating me for being on the side that bombed your mother. Or you can learn something, carry it home, and build something better. Fritz felt tears on his face but made no move to wipe them away. I do not know how to build something better. I only know how to be soldier. Then you learn, same as you learn to ride a horse. Same as Hans learned to bake American bread. You learn by doing, by failing, by getting up and trying again. Clay placed a hand on Fritz's shoulder. Your sister needs you. When this war ends, you will go to her, and you will take with you everything you learned here. Not just about America, about mercy, about second chances, about how enemies can break bread together and discover they are not so different after all. He squeezed once, then released. That is how you honor your parents, not by hating the people who killed them, but by making sure their deaths mean something. By building a Germany where children do not grow up learning to hate, where men do not march off to die for lies. Fritz nodded, unable to speak. But in that moment, something shifted inside him. The grief remained, the anger remained. But alongside them grew something new. Purpose, direction, a reason to survive that extended beyond mere survival. He would go home. He would find Greta. And he would show her what he had learned in this strange, abundant, impossible country called America. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The news reached Camp Hearn by radio crackling through speakers that had been installed in every barracks. Victory in Europe Day. VE Day. The Allies had won. Germany had surrendered. The prisoners reacted in different ways. Some wept with relief that the dying was finally over. Some sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that everything they had fought for had been ground into ash and dust. Kurt's faction, those hardliners who still believed, raged and shouted that this was impossible, that Germany could not lose, that the reports must be propaganda. But Fritz knew better. He had known for months. From the moment he tasted bacon and recognized abundance. From the moment he rode a horse across open land and understood freedom. From the moment Pastor James forgave him and he felt the weight of grace. Germany had lost because Germany had been wrong. And being wrong on such a scale meant paying a price measured in millions of dead and a nation reduced to rubble. The repatriation orders came slowly. Processing 5,000 prisoners took time, organization, coordination between multiple governments. Fritz spent the year waiting, working Clay's ranch, watching the seasons turn. He watched spring become summer, summer become fall, fall become winter again. He wrote letters to Greta when the Red Cross allowed it. Short messages that took months to arrive if they arrived at all. He told her about Texas, about Clay, about what he had learned. He promised he would come home. He promised he would help rebuild. And slowly, letter by letter, Greta began to respond. She was alive, surviving, waiting. May 10th, 1946, nearly 2 full years after Fritz had first arrived at Camp Hearn, the repatriation train sat on the tracks outside the camp, steam rising from its engine, ready to carry 200 German prisoners to the East Coast where ships waited to take them home. Clay drove Fritz to the station in his battered Ford. They rode in silence, the Texas landscape rolling past one final time. Fields of cotton already showing green. Cattle grazing fat in pastures that seemed to stretch forever. A sky so vast and blue, it made Fritz's chest ache with something he could not name. At the station, Clay cut the engine. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a bundle wrapped in brown paper. For you, he said. Fritz unwrapped it. Inside was Clay's old Stetson hat, the one he wore every single day. Beneath it, a photograph. Fritz and Clay standing by the corral, both of them smiling, Rebel the horse between them. Beneath that, an envelope containing $200 in cash, more money than Fritz had seen in 5 years. Clay, I cannot accept this. The hat, it is yours. The money, it is too much. The hat is mine to give. Fits you better than me anyway. The money is payment for work done. You earned it. Clay's voice was gruff, but his eyes were wet. Use it to build something good. A business, maybe. Whatever you need to get started again. Fritz clutched the bundle to his chest. I will never forget you. What you did for me. What you taught me. I know, that is why I did it. So you would go back to Germany and show them what is possible. Show them enemies can become friends. Show them mercy is not weakness. They stood facing each other on the platform. Around them, other prisoners said goodbye to the Americans they had worked with. Friendships formed across the divide of war, now ending in this bittersweet moment. Clay extended his hand. Fritz took it. Then the old rancher pulled him into an embrace, holding him tight. "You came here a Nazi," Clay whispered. "You leave as a free man. Do not ever forget the difference." "I will not," Fritz promised. "I swear it." They separated. Fritz boarded the train, his throat too tight for more words. He found a seat by the window and watched as the train pulled away from the station. Clay stood on the platform, his hand raised in farewell, growing smaller and smaller until distance and tears made him invisible. The journey back to Germany took 3 weeks. By ship to Bremen, by truck to Berlin. And when Fritz finally saw his homeland again, he barely recognized it. Berlin was a moonscape of rubble and ruin. Buildings stood like broken teeth against gray skies. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, scavenging for food or fuel or anything that could be traded for survival. Soviet soldiers patrolled the eastern sectors, American soldiers the western. The city was divided. Germany was divided, and the future was nothing but question marks and uncertainty. He found Greta living in the basement of their destroyed family home. She was 28 years old but looked 50. Her hair was prematurely gray. Her face was gaunt. Her eyes held the exhausted knowledge of someone who had seen too much horror to ever be young again. But when she saw Fritz, when she recognized her brother standing in the doorway wearing an American cowboy hat and carrying hope in his eyes, she broke down and sobbed like a child. They held each other in that basement while Berlin groaned and shifted around them, and Fritz whispered promises he intended to keep. He used Clay's $200 to start a business, horse training and ranch consulting for Germans who wanted to rebuild their agricultural industry using American methods. It was a strange profession in a country that had no horses left and barely any agriculture. But Fritz was patient, and slowly as the years passed and the Marshall Plan money began to flow, and Germany started to rise from the ashes, his business grew. He taught German farmers American techniques. Crop rotation learned from Clay. Animal husbandry practiced on Texas ranches. Management styles that valued workers rather than exploiting them. And always he talked about what he had learned in America, about freedom, about dignity, about the power of forgiveness. People thought he was crazy at first, but results spoke louder than ideology. Farms that followed his advice prospered. Workers who were treated with respect worked harder and complained less. And gradually, Fritz became known not as the former Nazi officer, but as the man who understood how to build something new. Hans returned to Munich and opened a bakery. He called it Texas Brot, Texas bread, and served both German and American pastries. He sent Clay a box of Stollen every Christmas for 18 years, each one accompanied by a letter describing his life, his success, his gratitude. The years accumulated like snow. 1946 became 1950, became 1960. Fritz married a schoolteacher named Annenfina who had also survived the war and wanted to build rather than mourn. They had 2 children, a son named Thomas after Clay's boy, a daughter named Charlotte. They raised them in a small house outside Berlin, teaching them German and English, telling them stories about Texas and cowboys and the importance of mercy. And every year on Christmas Eve, Fritz wore Clay's Stetson hat and told his children about the rancher who chose forgiveness over hate. June 6, 1964, the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Fritz, now 52 years old, stood in the arrivals terminal at Houston International Airport with his 15-year-old son Carl beside him. They had saved for 3 years to make this trip. Fritz's business was successful now, successful enough to afford plane tickets across the Atlantic, successful enough to spend 2 weeks in America revisiting the places that had changed his life. They rented a car and drove to Herne. The town had changed little. The same main street, the same church, the same sense of time moving slower here than in the rest of the world. Clay's ranch was 5 miles outside town, down a dirt road Fritz remembered like the lines on his own palm. His heart hammered as they pulled into the driveway past the corral, where Rebel had once grazed past the outdoor grill, where Bacon had first shown him the taste of freedom. The house looked older. The paint was faded. The porch sagged slightly, but it was still standing still solid, still home to the man who had saved Fritz's soul. Clay sat on the porch in a rocking chair, his hair white now, his face even more weathered, but his eyes still sharp and clear. He was 78 years old, retired from active ranching, living alone since his wife had passed 2 years before. He looked up as the car approached, squinted against the sun. Then his face broke into a smile so wide it threatened to crack. Fritz got out of the car. He was still wearing the Stetson hat Clay had given him 18 years ago, maintained and cared for with reverence, usually reserved for holy relics. Clay stood slowly, using the porch rail for balance. He stared at Fritz, at the hat, at the man who had been a broken prisoner and was now whole. "Well, I will be damned," Clay said, his voice rougher, but still carrying that Texas drawl. "Look what the cat dragged in." "Hello, old friend," Fritz said. They met halfway across the yard and embraced like the brothers they had become. Clay was smaller than Fritz remembered, shrunken by age, but his grip was still strong and his heart still beat with the same steady courage. "You kept the hat," Clay said, touching the brim. "I wear it every important day. Today is very important." Carl appreciated shyly this boy, who had heard stories about Clay Harrison his entire life but never met the legend in person. "This is my son, Carl," Fritz said. "Carl, this is Mr. Harrison, the man I told you about." Clay shook the boy's hand solemnly. "Your father talks about me, does he?" "Every day," Carl said in careful English. "He says you taught him what he should have learned in Germany, about freedom and dignity and forgiveness." "Well," Clay said, his voice thick, "your father taught me something too. Taught me that even enemies can become brothers. That mercy is stronger than revenge. That the future does not have to be a copy of the past." They spent the afternoon on the porch drinking sweet tea that was still too sweet for German tastes, but Fritz drank it anyway. Clay showed them photos of Thomas, his lost son, and told stories that made his boy live again in memory. Fritz told Clay about Germany, about Greta, who had married and had children of her own, about his business, about the Germany that was being rebuilt, stone by stone and soul by soul. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold, Clay turned to Fritz with serious eyes. "You kept your promise. You went back and built something good." "Because you showed me how," Fritz said simply. "No, I just showed you it was possible. You did the hard work. You chose mercy when hate would have been easier. You built when destroying would have been simpler." Clay reached out and gripped Fritz's shoulder. "I am proud of you, son. Thomas would have been proud too." They sat together as darkness fell, 3 generations bound by war and grace and the stubborn insistence that love was stronger than hate. Above them, the Texas stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had watched over a German prisoner learning to be free, the same stars that would shine long after all of them were dust. And in that moment, Fritz understood that he had not just survived the war, he had transcended it, had taken the worst thing that ever happened to him and transformed it into the best thing, had met his enemy and discovered a father, had tasted bacon and found redemption. America had saved him, not through conquest or cruelty, but through the simple, radical act of treating an enemy like a human being, of offering second chances, of choosing forgiveness when vengeance would have been justified. This was the America worth believing in, worth fighting for, worth carrying home and sharing with a broken world desperate for hope. Fritz never saw Clay again. The old rancher died in 1972, buried next to his wife and his son in the Hearn Cemetery under a Texas sky that went on forever. But he wrote to Fritz 2 weeks before the end, a letter that arrived after the funeral, and in it he said simply this: "Thank you for letting me honor my son by saving you. Thank you for proving that mercy works. Thank you for being the man I hoped you could become. You are my son too, Fritz. Always have been, always will be." Fritz kept that letter until his own death 40 years later. Kept it with the photograph and the Stetson hat and the memories of bacon and horses in a Methodist church where an old pastor chose grace over grief. And he told the story to his children, who told it to their children, who told it to theirs. The story of how one Texas rancher defeated the Third Reich, not with bullets, but with breakfast. Not with bombs, but with brotherhood. The story of how America won the war not by being the strongest, but by being the kindest. The story of how enemies became family and hate became love, and a cowboy hat became a symbol of everything worth fighting for. This is the power of the American spirit. Not conquest, not revenge, but the simple act of treating your enemy like a human being. of offering bacon when bullets would have been easier, of choosing tomorrow over yesterday. If this story moved you, remember it. Share it. Because in times like these, we all need reminded what makes America truly great. Not our weapons, not our wealth, but our willingness to forgive, to rebuild, to believe that every person, even our enemies, deserves a second chance. That is the America Fritz Muller discovered in a Texas prison camp. That is the America we must never forget.